The morning sun had barely peeked over the horizon at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport when Captain Tom Wilson began his usual pre-flight routine. Standing at the gate of Flight AA-237, he greeted passengers with a warm smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes, developed from years of genuine love for his profession. At 52, his salt-and-pepper hair and weather-worn face told stories of countless flights across endless skies. 20 years in the cockpit had taught Tom to trust his instincts. Like a sixth sense, he'd developed an ability to read the energy of his passengers, a skill that had saved him from more than a few troublesome situations. This morning, something felt different. As he stood at the gate, exchanging pleasant good mornings with boarding passengers, his attention kept drifting to a group hanging back from the main crowd. They stood out like a thundercloud on a clear day. 5 men, all wearing leather vests despite the Texas heat, clustered near the gate's charging station. Their hushed conversations and sharp glances toward the cockpit sent tiny warnings racing up Tom's spine. 2 decades of flying had taught him that trouble rarely announced itself, it whispered first. The tallest among them, sporting a thick gray beard and arms covered in faded tattoos, kept checking his phone and muttering to his companions. Their body language spoke volumes, shoulders tense, eyes darting, the kind of nervous energy that experienced pilots learn to spot from a mile away. Tom noticed how they seemed to be waiting for something or someone, letting other passengers go ahead of them in line. As he continued his greetings, Tom carefully observed their interaction with the gate agent. The bearded man handed over their tickets with a stiffness that seemed out of place for a routine flight. Their carry-on bags, all seemingly brand new and identical, added another piece to the puzzle that was starting to form in Tom's mind. He thought about his own background, the years spent in places he rarely talked about, doing work that never made it into official records. Those experiences had given him tools he hoped he'd never need to use again, especially not at 35,000 feet. But they had also taught him the value of being prepared, of noticing the small details that others might miss. The flight attendants were going through their usual pre-boarding checklist, their practice movements a dance of efficiency. Tom pulled aside his lead flight attendant, Robert, a veteran of the skies himself. "Keep an eye on our friends in the leather," he said quietly, his tone casual but his meaning clear. "Let's make sure they're comfortable, but stay alert." Robert gave a slight nod, understanding the unspoken message. They'd worked together long enough to communicate volumes in these small gestures. As Tom headed back to the cockpit for his final preparations, he felt that familiar tingle at the base of his neck, the one that had saved his life more than once in his previous career. His co-pilot was already running through the pre-flight checklist when he returned. The familiar routine of switches, gauges, and radio checks helped center his thoughts. Everything looked normal on paper, weather was clear, systems were green, fuel levels optimal. But Tom couldn't shake the feeling that this flight would be anything but routine. As the last passengers boarded, Tom heard the bikers' heavy boots on the jet bridge. He watched through the cockpit window as they filed past, their reflection in the morning sun casting long shadows across the tarmac. The day was about to get interesting, and not in the way anyone had planned. Tom took a deep breath, his hand automatically finding the smooth metal of his pilot's wings, a habit he'd developed over the years. Whatever was coming, he'd face it with the same calm precision that had guided him through countless situations, both in the air and on the ground. After all, the safety of everyone on board was his responsibility, and he'd learned long ago that the best way to handle trouble was to see it coming. The first hour of Flight AA-237 passed smoothly enough. The plane had reached its cruising altitude of 35,000 feet, and the soft hum of the engines had lulled many passengers into a peaceful morning nap. But like the calm before a storm, this peace wasn't meant to last. Robert, the lead flight attendant, was just finishing up the first beverage service when he noticed a change in the atmosphere. The group of bikers, who had been surprisingly quiet during takeoff, began shifting restlessly in their seats. The one with the gray beard, who'd introduced himself as Rick during boarding, kept pressing the call button, making increasingly specific demands about the flight crew. "How long has the pilot been flying this route?" Rick asked, his voice carrying an edge that made other passengers glance up from their books and tablets. When Robert gave a polite but vague response, Rick exchanged meaningful looks with his companions. Another member of the group, a stocky man with a bandana tied around his head, started pacing in the aisle, claiming he needed to use the bathroom, the one near the cockpit specifically. Each time he passed by, he seemed to linger a little longer, testing the boundaries of how close he could get to the cockpit door. The tension rose another notch when Rick confronted Lisa, one of the younger flight attendants, as she passed with the snack cart. "We need to speak to your pilot," he demanded, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "We've got reason to believe he's someone we know, goes by Rodriguez. Got some unfinished business with him." Lisa handled it professionally, explaining that the captain was busy ensuring everyone's safe journey. But the group wasn't satisfied. Their questions became more pressing, their tone more insistent. A mother traveling with her young daughter asked to be moved to seats further back in the plane, picking up on the growing unease. The other passengers had started to notice too. An elderly couple exchanged worried glances. A businessman in row 14 pretended to work on his laptop while clearly keeping an eye on the situation. Even the usually boisterous group of college students returning from spring break had fallen silent, their earlier laughter replaced by tense whispers. In the galley, Robert quietly briefed his fellow flight attendants. "Keep your movements casual," he instructed, his years of experience evident in his calm demeanor. "But stay within sight of each other." He'd seen enough situations in his career to know that preparation was key, but panic was the enemy. The bikers' frustration grew when they realized they weren't getting the response they wanted. Their voices got louder, their demands more frequent. "Look," Rick said, leaning over his seat to catch Robert's attention, "we know Rodriguez is flying this plane. We've tracked him down, and he can't hide forever." What the group didn't realize was that every word, every movement was being carefully noted and communicated to the cockpit. The flight attendants had developed a simple code over the years, casual phrases that could convey urgency without alarming other passengers. And right now, those phrases were being put to good use. In the cockpit, Tom received the updates with growing concern. Through the intercom, he could hear the edge in Robert's voice as he calmly asked if the captain would like some coffee, their agreed-upon signal for a situation requiring attention. Tom knew he had a decision to make, and soon. The atmosphere in the cabin had become like a tightly wound spring. Other passengers were doing their best to appear absorbed in their books or screens, but everyone could feel it, that unmistakable tension that comes when something's about to give. The air felt thick with anticipation, like the moment before a thunderclap. The bikers had no idea that their target, this Rodriguez they were looking for, wasn't even on the plane. More importantly, they had no clue about who they were actually dealing with. As Tom contemplated his next move, he knew one thing for certain. This situation needed to be handled carefully, but decisively. Lives depended on what he did next. In the cramped confines of the cockpit, Tom's hands moved steadily over the controls, maintaining their course despite the growing chaos behind him. His co-pilot, Mike, had just received another coded message from Robert about the escalating situation. The bikers were getting more agitated, their demands to see the pilot becoming less like requests and more like threats. "Captain," Robert's voice came through the intercom, using their pre-arranged signal phrase, "the coffee service is getting a bit complicated back here." Tom knew exactly what that meant. Things were reaching a tipping point. Through the cabin camera feed, he could see Rick and his group huddled together, their discussion becoming more animated by the minute. As Tom watched the situation unfold, his mind drifted briefly to a time long ago, in places far less comfortable than this cockpit. Before he'd ever dreamed of flying commercial jets, he'd spent 15 years in the Marines, specifically in Force Recon. Those years had taught him more than just tactical skills. They'd taught him how to read people, how to defuse situations before they exploded. He remembered his last mission as team leader, deep in territory where everything could change in a heartbeat. It was there he'd learned his most valuable lesson. Sometimes the biggest shows of force came wrapped in the quietest packages. That knowledge had served him well in transitioning to civilian life, and now it might just help him handle this situation. Mike glanced over, concern evident in his expression. "Tom, we should probably alert air traffic control. Get authorization for an emergency landing." It was the standard protocol, and under normal circumstances, it would have been the right call. But Tom had handled enough high-stakes situations to know that sometimes standard protocol could make things worse. Through the cabin camera, they watched as Rick's group became more confrontational. The stocky man with the bandana had now planted himself firmly in the aisle, refusing to return to his seat despite Robert's polite but firm requests. Other passengers were visibly uncomfortable. A young couple had pulled their children closer, and an off-duty pilot traveling as a passenger kept looking toward the cockpit with growing concern. Tom noticed something else too. The way Rick's hands kept shaking slightly when he gestured, the nervous glances between his companions. These weren't hardened criminals. They were angry men making bad decisions at 35,000 feet. That observation told Tom everything he needed to know about how to handle this. The memories of his military training surfaced again, the countless hours spent learning to read body language, to spot the difference between real threats and bluffs, to understand when force was needed and when words would work better. In Force Recon, they'd called it the quiet approach, the art of diffusing situations through presence rather than power. Robert's voice came through again, this time with real urgency behind his professional tone. "Captain, our friends in rows 15 through 17 are insisting on speaking with you about maintenance concerns." The code phrase sent a clear message. The situation couldn't wait any longer. Tom made his decision. Turning to Mike, he began a quick but thorough briefing. "I'm going back there," he said, his voice calm and measured. "Keep us steady on course, but be ready for anything. If things go south, you know the emergency protocols." Mike nodded, understanding the weight of what wasn't being said. As Tom stood up, he caught his reflection in the cockpit window. The man looking back at him wasn't just a pilot anymore. He was every role he'd ever played: Marine, leader, peacekeeper. He straightened his uniform, a habit ingrained from years of service. His fingers brushed against the wings on his chest, wings earned through years of dedication to keeping people safe, whether in combat zones or commercial flights. The irony wasn't lost on him. These bikers had come looking for someone named Rodriguez, hoping to settle some old score. Instead, they were about to meet someone whose entire career, both military and civilian, had been built on handling exactly this type of situation. As Tom reached for the cockpit door, he took a deep breath, centering himself the way he'd done countless times before critical moments. What happened next would depend entirely on his ability to read the situation correctly and apply the right kind of pressure, not too much, not too little. Just like in his Force Recon days, lives hung in the balance. But this time, he was protecting not just his team, but a plane full of innocent passengers who just wanted a peaceful flight to San Francisco. The weight of the moment pressed heavily on Tom as he stood in the narrow corridor just outside the cockpit. Through the small window in the door, he could see the main cabin, where the tension had reached a breaking point. Most pilots would have already called for an emergency landing or radioed for law enforcement to meet them at the nearest airport. But Tom knew something they didn't. Sometimes the most dangerous move was the obvious one. He thought about his options carefully. Standard procedure would have him lock down the cockpit, divert the flight, and let authorities handle it on the ground. It was the safe play, the one that would keep him out of harm's way. But Tom had learned long ago that safe and right weren't always the same thing. He could see the fear in the eyes of the young mother clutching her child 3 rows back, the barely contained panic in the elderly couple who kept glancing nervously at the bikers. Through the cabin speakers, Mike's voice remained steady as he gave a routine update about weather conditions ahead. It was their agreed-upon signal. Everything was set. Tom had briefed him thoroughly. Keep the plane on course, monitor all systems, and be ready to implement emergency protocols if needed. They'd worked together long enough that Mike understood what wasn't being said. Robert approached quietly, his experienced eyes taking in Tom's expression. "The gentleman with the beard, Rick, he's becoming more insistent," he whispered. "Says he knows for certain that Rodriguez is in the cockpit. The others are getting worked up too." Robert paused, then added what they both knew. "We've got 2 more hours to San Francisco. They're not going to wait that long." Tom nodded, processing the information. He could hear the bikers now, their voices carrying through the cabin despite their attempts to keep quiet. "Rodriguez can't hide forever," one was saying. "He's got to come out sometime." The irony of their mistake might have been funny under different circumstances. A memory surfaced from Tom's Force Recon days, a tense standoff in a remote village. His commanding officer had taught him something valuable that day. The most dangerous person in any room is the one who hasn't shown their hand yet. Right now, that person was him. These bikers thought they had the upper hand, thought they knew exactly who they were dealing with. Their certainty was their weakness. Tom checked his watch, 10:47 a.m. They were cruising at 35,000 feet over the western states, too far from their destination to just wait it out, too high to risk a serious confrontation. The decision he was about to make went against every standard protocol in commercial aviation. But then again, standard protocols were written for standard situations. He turned to Robert, his voice low but firm. "I want you to do something specific. When I step out there, I need you to make sure the aisle stays clear. Don't make it obvious, but get anyone who isn't part of their group moved away from that area." Robert's eyes widened slightly as he realized what Tom was planning, but he nodded without question. Through the cabin camera feed, Tom watched as Robert smoothly began implementing his request. The flight attendant's decades of experience showed in how naturally he moved through the cabin, quietly suggesting seat changes to passengers while keeping the bikers in his peripheral vision. Tom straightened his uniform one last time, a habit from his military days. He thought about all the different kinds of courage he'd seen over the years, the loud, showy kind that got all the attention and the quiet, steady kind that actually got things done. Today would require the second type. The plane hit a small patch of turbulence, causing the overhead bins to rattle slightly. Tom used that moment to take one final deep breath. He'd made his decision. Instead of hiding in the cockpit or calling for an emergency landing, he was going to face this head-on. Not with force or threats, but with something the bikers wouldn't expect: calm, controlled confidence. As he reached for the door handle, Tom remembered something his old drill instructor used to say. The best way to handle a powder keg isn't to throw water on it, it's to remove the fuse before it can light. These bikers were looking for a fight with Rodriguez. What they were about to get instead was a lesson in real authority, the kind that doesn't need to shout to be heard. The moment Tom stepped into the main cabin, the atmosphere shifted. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, and all eyes turned toward him. He moved with the kind of quiet confidence that comes from years of handling high-pressure situations. The overhead lights caught the 4 gold stripes on his uniform sleeve, gleaming like quiet warnings. Rick, the bearded leader of the biker group, was halfway out of his seat before he realized someone was approaching. His eyes narrowed as he took in Tom's appearance, not the Hispanic man he'd expected to find, but a tall, weather-worn pilot with gray-peppered hair and steady eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "Gentlemen," Tom said, his voice carrying easily through the hushed cabin without being raised. "I understand there's been some confusion about who's flying this aircraft." He stood relaxed but alert, his hands visible and open at his sides. A deliberate choice from his military training. The stocky man with the bandana started to push forward, but something in Tom's stance made him hesitate. It wasn't anything obvious, just the way the pilot carried himself, the way his feet were planted, the calm assessment in his eyes. Years of experience had taught the bikers to recognize when someone knew how to handle themselves. "This isn't about you," Rick said, but his earlier confidence had wavered. "We're looking for Rodriguez. We know he's flying this route." He tried to make it sound threatening, but the words came out more like a question. Tom nodded thoughtfully, as if they were discussing something as simple as the weather. "I'm Captain Tom Wilson," he said, his voice remaining conversational, but carrying an undertone of authority that made several passengers sit up straighter in their seats. "I've been flying this route for the past 8 years. Before that, I spent 15 years as a Force Recon Marine." The change in the bikers' demeanor was immediate but subtle. The way they glanced at each other, the slight shift in their posture, these were men who understood what Force Recon meant. Tom continued, his tone remaining professional and calm. "I can see you're looking for someone who wronged you. While I'm not him, I'd be happy to discuss this situation like reasonable men once we're safely on the ground." An older businessman a few rows back watched the scene unfold with visible relief. A young mother who had been clutching her daughter's hand loosened her grip slightly. Even the air in the cabin seemed to grow lighter. "Right now," Tom went on, making eye contact with each of the bikers in turn, "my priority is ensuring the safety of everyone on this aircraft, and that includes you gentlemen. I respect that you have business to handle, but this isn't the time or place. I think you can understand that." The way he said it, not as a threat or a play, but as a simple statement of fact, seemed to resonate with the group. Rick's shoulders dropped slightly, the first sign of tension releasing. The others looked to him, waiting for his response. Rick started, then cleared his throat. We got information that Rodriguez would be flying today. We've been tracking him for months. The anger in his voice had been replaced by something else, embarrassment, perhaps, or the slow realization of how their actions must look to the other passengers. Tom nodded again, understanding in his expression. Information isn't always accurate, he said. But what is accurate is that right now, we're at 35,000 feet with another hour and a half of flight time ahead of us. I've got 142 souls on board who are counting on a safe journey. I'm sure men like you can appreciate that responsibility. The way he said, men like you, with respect rather than condescension, seemed to touch something in the bikers. They were used to being treated with suspicion or fear. This straightforward acknowledgement of their humanity, especially from someone they'd planned to intimidate, caught them off guard. Now, Tom continued, his voice. The next 30 minutes on Flight AA-237 felt like watching ice thaw in spring. A gradual but unmistakable warming of the atmosphere. Tom had remained in the cabin, taking a seat in the flight attendant's jump chair where he could keep a casual eye on everything while chatting with passengers. It wasn't standard procedure, but then again, nothing about this flight had been standard. Rick and his group had settled back into their seats, the fight gone out of them like air from a punctured tire. Tom noticed how the stocky man with the bandana kept glancing his way, not with hostility anymore, but with something that looked like respect. It reminded him of his days training new Marines, how sometimes the toughest ones were just looking for someone who could show them a better way to be strong. "Captain," Rick said suddenly, his voice carrying across the now quiet cabin. "Can I have a word?" The other passengers tensed slightly, but Tom saw something different in Rick's expression, the look of a man who had something to get off his chest. Tom moved over casually, taking the empty seat across the aisle. "Of course," he said, keeping his voice friendly but professional. The other passengers pretended not to listen, but everyone was tuned into every word. "I just wanted to say..." Rick started, then paused, struggling with words that didn't come easily to him. "Well, we messed up here. Bad. Rodriguez, he took advantage of my sister. Ran some kind of investment scam, took her life savings. Been trying to track him down for months." He rubbed his beard nervously. "But this wasn't the way to handle it." Tom nodded, understanding flooding his features. Sometimes the loudest actions came from the deepest hurts. "There are better ways to get justice," he said quietly. "Ways that don't put innocent people at risk or get you in trouble with federal aviation laws." A flight attendant passed by with water for everyone, her movements natural and unhurried now. The young mother who had been so frightened earlier was letting her daughter color in a book, the crayons occasionally rolling onto Rick's tray table. Each time, he carefully picked them up and handed them back with a small, apologetic smile. "In my Marine days," Tom said, his voice low enough that only Rick and his nearby friends could hear, "I learned that true strength isn't about forcing your way through situations. It's about knowing when to step back and find a better approach." He paused, letting that sink in. "What happened to your sister? That's something that needs to be handled through proper channels. I've got some contacts in financial crimes who might be able to point you in the right direction." Rick's eyes widened slightly. He hadn't expected help, especially not after how they'd behaved. The other bikers leaned in, listening intently as Tom explained how they could file proper complaints and work with authorities to track down the real Rodriguez. The businessman who had been watching everything unfold caught Tom's eye and gave a supple nod of appreciation. He'd seen enough corporate negotiations to recognize a masterclass in turning enemies into allies. Around them, the cabin had returned to its normal rhythm. The college students had resumed their quiet chatter, an elderly couple was sharing a crossword puzzle, and the off-duty pilot, who had been so tense earlier, was now dozing peacefully. The only evidence of the earlier confrontation was in the slightly sheepish expressions of Rick and his group. One of the younger bikers, who hadn't spoken much during the whole incident, finally broke his silence. "You know," he said, looking at Tom with genuine curiosity, "most people would have just called the cops on us. Had us arrested when we landed." Tom smiled slightly. In my experience, most people who act tough are usually carrying around some kind of pain. Sometimes they just need someone to show them a different path. He glanced out the window at the clouds below. Besides, getting you arrested wouldn't help your sister get her money back, would it? The way he said it, practical, understanding, but firm, seemed to hit home with all of them. He was a man who commanded respect not through intimidation, but through a quiet, unshakable authority that came from years of handling difficult situations and difficult people. Robert, passing by with the drink cart, couldn't help but marvel at the transformation. The same men who had been causing such alarm just an hour ago were now sitting quietly, looking more like embarrassed schoolboys than threatening bikers. It was a reminder that sometimes the most powerful weapon against aggression wasn't force, it was understanding backed by unwavering strength. As Flight AA-237 began its descent into San Francisco International Airport, the golden afternoon sun streamed through the windows, casting a warm glow throughout the cabin. The mood had shifted so dramatically that new passengers would never have guessed the tension that had filled these same aisles just hours earlier. Tom had returned to the cockpit for landing procedures, leaving behind a cabin that felt more like a community than a collection of strangers. Rick and his group sat quietly, their earlier aggression replaced by visible remorse and, surprisingly, occasional friendly interactions with nearby passengers. The young girl who had been scared earlier was now proudly showing Rick had a completed coloring book, while her mother watched with cautious but growing acceptance. San Francisco Tower, this is American 237 on final approach. Tom's voice was steady as he guided the massive aircraft down through scattered clouds. Mike, his co-pilot, handled the radio communications while stealing glances at his captain. He'd seen a lot in his years of flying, but never had he witnessed someone handle a potentially dangerous situation with such skill and humanity. As the plane touched down with a gentle bump, a spontaneous round of applause broke out, not just the usual clapping for a smooth landing, but something more meaningful. It was an acknowledgement of everything that hadn't happened, of a crisis averted through wisdom rather than force. The terminal was visible through the windows now, and with it, the unmistakable presence of airport security. Standard protocol meant they had to be there, even though the situation had been resolved peacefully. Tom had radioed ahead, not to request arrests, but to arrange for a proper escort and to ensure his promise of helping Rick's group find legal assistance could be fulfilled. As passengers began gathering their belongings, something unexpected happened. Rick stood up, his imposing frame somehow less threatening now, and addressed the cabin. "I want to apologize to everyone." His voice was rough with emotion. "What we did today, it wasn't right. We let our anger about a bad situation push us into making even worse choices." The elderly couple who had been so frightened earlier nodded in acceptance. The businessman who had watched everything unfold closed his laptop and gave Rick an understanding look. Even the college students who had been whispering about the situation throughout the flight fell silent in respect for the moment. Tom emerged from the cockpit one last time, standing at the front of the cabin as passengers prepared to deplane. Robert, who had handled the situation with remarkable professionalism, stood nearby, both men watching as their unique group of passengers began to file out. The young mother paused as she passed Rick, her daughter clutching her hand. "I hope you find justice for your sister," she said quietly. It was a small moment, but it captured everything about how the situation had transformed, from fear to understanding, from tension to compassion. As security officers boarded to escort Rick and his group, Tom stepped forward. "Remember what we discussed," he said, handing Rick a business card with contact information for financial crimes investigators. "There's always a right way to handle things, no matter how wrong the situation might be." The other passengers watched as the bikers were led away, not in handcuffs, but with dignity intact. Tom had arranged for them to be questioned and processed separately from the main terminal, avoiding any public spectacle. It was one last act of respect that didn't go unnoticed by anyone. Later that evening, as the crew gathered for their post-flight debrief, the story was already spreading through the airline's ranks. What could have been a disaster had instead become a powerful lesson in conflict resolution. The airline's security team wanted to know every detail, recognizing that there was something valuable to be learned from how Tom had handled the situation. "You know," Robert said thoughtfully during the debrief, "in all my years of flying, I've never seen anyone turn enemies into allies quite like that." The other crew members nodded in agreement. Tom just smiled, remembering his old Marine commander's words about true strength showing itself in how you handle those who oppose you. The incident would indeed become a case study in airline security training, but not for the reasons anyone might have expected. It wasn't a story about overpowering threats or enforcing rules. It was about understanding human nature, about finding the hurt behind the anger, and about knowing when strength means showing compassion rather than force. As Tom packed up his flight bag that evening, he found a note that had been slipped under the cockpit door. In rough handwriting, it read, "Thank you for treating us like humans who made a mistake, not criminals who couldn't change." It was signed simply, Rick and crew. He folded the note carefully and put it in his pocket, knowing that sometimes the biggest victories are the ones where nobody loses, where wisdom prevails over force, and where understanding becomes the strongest weapon of all.